Okay. We just got a few more people attending. I think there might be a few more coming in as we go, but I think we can go ahead. Just to let you know, first off, this meeting is being recorded. That's so that people who aren't able to attend right now can view it later on at their convenience. And then the other thing I just want to request before we get started is please mute your microphones. You will be able to use the chat box to make any questions that you have, and we can unmute you as necessary at that point. Okay. All right, well, we can go ahead and get started then. Welcome to our first webinar of 2021. It's called Current Estimates and Trends in New Hampshire's Housing Supply. This is part of a new monthly series of planning-related webinars that our office is producing in order to get information to you on a timely basis. I'm Ken Gallagher, a principal planner who has been at OSI since 1988. For people who are coming on later, this webinar is being presented on January 8th, 2021. It will be available on our website for later or repeated viewing. Like I just mentioned, while you're here today, please feel free to ask any questions and use the chat box on your display. A member of our staff will be monitoring the chat section and passing your questions along. The housing report was created in our office through the New Hampshire State Data Center, which serves as the state liaison to the U.S. Census Bureau. The SDC has three main activities. First, to distribute and interpret data produced by the Census Bureau. Second, to engage in various projects that supply data produced in our state to the Census Bureau for their operations. And this includes annual projects as well as additional work during the decennial censuses. And third, to produce annual population estimates for the state and its municipalities. And our housing report is one product that comes about from the work we do creating those population estimates. Okay, here's the statutory language that authorizes our project. It's specifically RSA 78A 25. It directs the office to estimate annually the resident population for all cities and towns as of July 1st of the preceding year, and to certify those numbers to the state treasurer on or before August 19th. So RSA 78 calls for these population estimates because that is the source for the state's determination of how its meals and rooms tax is distributed to every municipality. So it's fairly important. And actually, I think that the fact that every town depends on these population estimates to be sure they receive their full share of the meals and rooms tax is why we are actually able to have 100% participation in the survey, something we're quite proud of. However, the estimates can also be used for many other purposes. They can be used for developing the town's master plan, for transportation planning, education planning, applying for grants, etc. So let's look at the components that we use in our state population estimates. There's just a few of them. We start with the numbers obtained in the most recent decennial census, which is still 2010 at this point. We then look at the change in the number of dwelling units in each town or city. And then we add the number of people living in group quarters, such as skilled nursing facilities, prisons, on-campus college housing, etc. The housing report that we're talking about now comes about as the result of the annual dwelling unit survey portion of the study, which we send out to cities and towns. Let's take a look at the method we use to go from the number of dwelling units added or lost in a year to a population estimate. We will use the numbers that we have collected and calculated for one town in the state as an example. This was done when we calculated the 2019 population estimates. We start with the number of housing units at the 2010 census, which is the most recent one available at this point. And we see there were 4,281 housing units for this town in 2010. So then we take the total of housing units permitted from 2011 through 2018, which was 141, for a new total of 4,422 housing units. And that's by the middle of 2019 because we factor in a 6-month lag time between the issuing of the dwelling permit and construction. Then we look at the occupancy rate when it was last counted in 2010, and in this case that number is 0.501. And that's because this happens to be a lake community with a large number of second homes or vacation homes. And our method holds that occupancy rate constant through the decade. So we apply the 0.501, and that gives us 2,216 occupied dwellings as of 2019. And then we use another figure calculated in 2010 at the census, which is persons per household. And in this case, it's 2.45. So that gives us an estimated population living in housing units as 5,428. Here's a sample of our dwelling unit survey, and the numbers on it are ones that we created for this presentation. So when we sent this one out, we were looking for the number of permits issued in 2019, and we then assumed those as having been constructed by July 1st of 2020. The form has columns for new residential construction, with subcolumns of numbers of buildings and numbers of dwelling units, and then columns for residential demolitions, also by building and by dwelling unit. And then finally, there are columns for expired permits, but we're not going to use those in this illustration. We have rows for single-family housing first, and then various levels of multifamily housing, plus manufactured housing. And then for our housing report, we combine the units starting with 2 or more families up through conversions to get our number of multifamily units permitted. So here we are. Let's look at the results for 2019-2020. Statewide, we found that a total of 4,483 housing units were permitted in 2019. That's statewide. So this continues the mostly steady increase from the low point in 2011, which was 2,101 units. But notice that we are still at less than half the number of units permitted at the previous peak, which was in 2004, when 9,263 units were permitted. Statewide, we find that multifamily units now represent a greater share of the total than they did in 2010. The 2019 data show that 2,121 units, or 47.3% of the statewide total, were multifamily, while in 2010 only 740 units, or 31.8%, were multifamily. Single-family units have also increased from 1,546 to 2,259, but that's at a slower rate than the multifamily increased. Meanwhile, manufactured housing remains at about 2% of total permits issued. Looking within the state, we see that there's quite a difference in the number of permits issued from county to county. As in previous years, you will see that the greatest amount of growth was in the southeastern part of the state, with a few outliers. Notice that Rockingham and Hillsborough counties each saw more than 500 single-family dwelling units permitted, and that Merrimack County with 290 units and Carroll County with 200 units had the next greatest numbers of units. Looking at multifamily, Hillsborough had a few more units than Rockingham County, 765 versus 696, followed by Stratford County at 313, and Grafton County at 149. And we note that in 3 counties, Rockingham, Hillsborough, and Stratford, there were more permits issued for multifamily than single-family units. Okay, here's a map showing the distribution of the types of building permits and also the total number of building permits issued by county. So each county has its own little pie chart, and the size of the pie chart in each county represents the total number of units. Single-family units are in blue, multifamily are in red, and manufactured housing is just barely visible in yellow. And you can see how the red of multifamily dominates in Hillsborough, Rockingham, and Stratford counties, while blue single-family dominates in most of the other counties. Here are a few highlights from the number of units permitted at the municipal level. The most single-family units were permitted in Salem at 67. As a percentage of the existing housing stock, though, Hart's location had the greatest growth, which was 4.9%, representing 3 units. The most multifamily units were permitted in the town of Merrimack, which was 358. And Salem, Bedford, Dover, Londonderry, Rochester, and Portsmouth each issued permits for more than 100 multifamily units. And once again, the greatest percent increase occurred in a town with a small starting number of units, in this case Gilsum, where there were 2 multifamily units permitted for a growth of 50%. All right, we will now switch over to a map viewer that Noah Hodgetts has developed for us using ArcGIS Online, which will allow us to look more closely at the results in the housing report. Okay, can everybody see? We now have a map on the screen. Okay. Can highlight the regional planning commissions if we wish with this map. And the first thing we can show is by county. And we have sort of a similar presentation as the static map that I showed you a couple slides back, where we have larger circles for larger numbers of units permitted. And we also have blue for counties where more multifamily were issued, and orange or red, depending on what your screen is doing, for the other counties where more single family were permitted. And you can actually also see that the intensity of the color decreases as the amount of, as the preponderance, let's say, of the particular style of permit gets lower, gets closer to 50%. So Grafton County, and we can actually click on these places for more information. We'll see that Grafton County had 160 single-family permits, and if you count multifamily plus manufactured, there's 154 of those. So it's barely more than 50% single-family, and therefore it's shaded kind of lightly. By the way, I'm showing you all this because this is something that you can access, and there will be a link for this later on. You can look at this at your leisure, look at your own town, or look at your region. So we've got shadings of the counties based on the different types of permits being issued. Single family, most numbers down in Hillsborough and Rockingham. Similarly, multifamily, again, Hillsborough and Rockingham, but now Stratford stands up as well with multifamily. And interestingly, Grafton. I'm going to see, just a moment here, I'm going to guess that a lot of that multifamily in Grafton was in the city of Lebanon. Let me see if I can zoom in a little. And I'm not getting that info right now. Oh, maybe it's because I'm looking at the county level. I'll come back to Lebanon in a moment. We can also see that manufactured housing. Again, this is a kind of a small number, so the gradation is probably not nearly as dramatic as you might see on the map here. It's only up to somewhere less than 30 at the highest level, which I think is Merrimack County. And we actually have one now here for total residential permits being issued. This is not factored into existing, this is simply just raw numbers of totals. We also have the same information available at the municipal level. Here are the individual towns and cities in the state, and you can see some very interesting things going on. First, down here in the southeast part of the state, here are some of the towns we've already mentioned, all of them with fairly large amounts of multifamily, Salem especially, and Merrimack with the most, and a few on the seacoast, Dover, Rochester, Portsmouth. Like I mentioned before, some of the communities, the coloring is a little lighter. So for instance, if we look at Concord, we can see that Concord had 26 single family, 45 multifamily, and 14 manufactured. So it's not all like one type of housing being permitted. There are actually a few communities where it turns out that, here we go, where it turns out that in fact manufactured housing was the greatest number. And in this case, the town of Grafton, that's because there were no permits for single family or multifamily, and there was just one for manufactured housing. So, and again, just like with the counties, you can see the distribution of the permit types by municipality. We already mentioned Salem being high for single family, but interestingly, Hooksett was the other highest number, over 60. Then we have a few others sort of again in the areas of the state that you would expect, mostly in the southern and eastern parts of the state. I should also mention, if you look at this, we do have some places where we might have a negative number. Let me see if this is one of them. Well, no, this is a 0. But you will see a few where there's actually a negative number of building permits, and those are cases where the number of demolitions was greater than the number of new permits issued. And then finally, you'll also see that there's some grayed out areas, and those are simply the unincorporated parts of the state. So there's no, I guess there are a few of those unincorporated areas that do have new buildings added, but we do not track them in this study. Here's the same idea, in this case for multifamily, and there's Merrimack that's standing out, along with Bedford right near it. And manufactured, like I said before with the manufactured, just because it's really dark, like Concord or New Hampton, doesn't mean it's of the same intensity of development as for the others. If you look at the legend, you'll see it's just between 10 and 14. And then here is the overall number of units. So those are the things you can look at while while looking through our data. I think it would be really useful, especially if even if you're looking from one town, just to compare how your neighboring towns are growing, because that will make a difference for your own town's growth. I'll point out a few other features in this mapper. There is a search box up on the upper right. You can type in the name of your town, or actually anywhere. It's doesn't even have to be in New Hampshire, but if you want to use this survey, you should just type in the name of your town or some other town in New Hampshire. And we also have a menu over here in the upper left where you can bookmark locations, or you can print your document, print whatever map you happen to produce out. So just a small thing, but it does help visualize the information if that's what you would like to do. Okay, I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint at this point. Okay. So, in conclusion, we have a few takeaways from our 2019 report. First, we found that housing growth continues to be focused in the southern and eastern regions of the state. And we also found that much of the growth is occurring in the towns and cities that are already the larger ones in the state. Because our office has also been tracking what land use regulations are enforced at the municipal level, we are interested in doing further research as to the relation of housing growth and the existence of innovative land use regulations. And then finally, bear in mind that the 2020 census data, which will be released this spring, will reset the formula that we use for estimating populations going forward. And here are the links for accessing the housing report and the associated data. So the report and the data are both available on our website. And then the last link is the link to the viewer that we were just looking at. So at this point, I can ask if anybody has any questions. If you do, please type them in the chat, and Noah will read them out to us. While we're waiting for that, and if you have any other questions after you're done looking at this, you can always contact me directly by email as listed here, and there's my phone number as well. And finally, we have the link to the New Hampshire State Data Center pages on our website. Okay, let me see, I've got a couple things on the chat here, possibly. Maybe not. Okay. Okay. Last chance. Maybe I'll unmute people if anybody wants to just speak up at this point. Otherwise, let's just see here. Oh, here's one. Couple people raising their hands. Okay, tell you what, I will unmute. And wait a minute. I'm sorry, I'm having a little bit of a technology issue. I'm not seeing the ability to unmute.
I think I can do that.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Do you see the list of people there, Noah?
I do. Okay.
Okay, so Sam Thomas, you can go ahead with your question.
Oh, yes, and maybe everybody else understands. What is manufactured housing?
Yeah, right. That's actually a good question. We're looking at, in my opinion, it looks like we're looking at mobile homes, basically. So we're not really talking about site-built modular housing or anything like that, but simply the types of structures you would find in mobile home parks mainly, but also, you know, they don't have to be in mobile home parks if they're also, you know, just on somebody's property. But that is really what we're counting here. We actually, and ultimately it's up to the building inspector to make that determination, but we do give guidance for that when we do our survey.
And second question now is in your formula, in your equation, after you did the census data, you had a -18. Is that a factor that was derived in formulating the equation?
Okay, let me go back. Am I still sharing my screen? Is that? I think I am.
Yeah, we can still see your screen. Yep.
Okay. Oh no, yeah, that's just typography there. Sorry, it's what that means is we're looking at housing units that have been added from 2011 through 2018. So that's all the 2011 -18 means. It's not a minus sign. So yeah, sorry about the confusion there.
Okay, as I read the equation, it would be -18 after you did the lesson. Okay, thank you.
And I see a typo in the illustration actually, because up above I wrote 2011 to 19. Just to clarify, this particular report, we counted housing units permitted through 2019. But for the example that I gave, I used the example that we did for our most recent population estimate, which we released valid through July 1st of 2019, which only counts housing units permitted through 2018. So that's the confusion there. I admit to you, it confused me to no end when I first started doing this work, that we're basically working a year and a half behind based because of the way the permits are issued.
Thank
so
you.
Thanks for your questions.
Thank you.
Okay, it looks like Will Ludd, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, is also asking a question.
Still muted.
Yeah, I don't know if I can. Can you? I cannot.
Yeah, can you hear me
Okay,
now?
there we go. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep, we can hear you.
Yeah, this is Will Lute. I'm from Amherst, New Hampshire, and we're getting ready to redo our town-wide master plan. And I noticed that the data that you show right now is for single-family homes and multi-family homes. Do you have data on like workforce housing for the towns? Because that's a really big issue for us in Amherst.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, this particular project doesn't record anything other than numbers of units per building permit. So we don't have any more detailed information that we collect. That would probably be something more at the regional planning commission level.
Yeah, the commissions, yeah, they probably would have that. But I just didn't know if there was any other types of housing that you looked at other than single family and the multifamily.
Yeah, if it's simply the number of dwelling units per structure is what we're looking at.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So we have a few questions in the chat box. Chris Parker is asking, will there be a similar presentation for the entire decade from 2010 to 2019?
Wow.
Rather than just a focus on 2019.
Well, that's a really good question, and I don't see why we can't put out something like that. We might not turn it into a webinar, but you never know. But we could certainly make a report for the decade.
Great. And then Susan Slack is asking, do you have any conclusions about the relationship between housing growth and innovative land use regulations?
Right. Yeah, I think we don't have any conclusions at this point. That the information is kind of is certainly of interest, and I think we might be able to demonstrate a correlation. But again, the question is what does that mean? Is there actually causation involved? And so that will certainly require more analysis.
Great. And then we have an additional question from Tim Medavere with Summersworth. Says, if manufactured housing is placed on a permanent foundation on its own land, is it considered a new housing unit? It would not be counted as a new manufactured housing unit.
I would have to go and consult our guidance that we give out to the building inspectors. I don't know that answer off my head. If there's a foundation involved, I think you're going to be calling that single family housing, but that's I'd better not cast that particular answer in stone. But that's my general belief.
Great. It looks like we have a couple more people who have raised their hands. Michael Thornton.
Oh yeah.
You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I also typed my question into the chat.
Okay.
If many of you must have seen the recent trend, which only goes back a few years, tiny housing. Many people have expressed to me an interest in, since the towns are doing away with, quote, trailer parks, to have some place they would be permitted to put a tiny house. And these can be, as you pointed out, either on a foundation or on a, call it a rubber foundation, if you will, and they are highly migratory in that configuration. As the work comes and goes, so will the worker in a tiny house. So anything you have on something like that would be very important.
Yeah. In terms of this particular study, we have asked building inspectors to, the towns to specify any subgroups like tiny housing or things like that. It's simply what they've issued permits for. I know that, however, that let me ask Noah this, with our municipal land use regulations database, are we recording that information in terms of what towns are regulating tiny houses?
So we do have a question on the municipal land use regulations survey, which our office also administers, on tiny house regulations. However, right now it really, because there is no very clear state enabling legislation, different towns are defining having enacted tiny house regulations differently. A lot of towns are just saying, I've adopted tiny house regulations because our minimum unit size is X, is say 400 square feet, and that is our tiny house regulations. And we have had discussions internally about whether we could track tiny houses or say accessory dwelling units separately. And the issue is just that, in this survey, we're trying to do as much of an apples to apples comparison. And it gets really difficult without some governing state statute which classifies anything as a tiny house, to be able to really know that town A is saying I've produced a tiny house under certain conditions, and town B may also be saying I produced it, or a tiny house has been permitted under different conditions. And then you have a potential of saying, okay, you're not necessarily getting an apples to apples comparison in that case. And that's why we have been hesitant to add, more specific questions about tiny houses or about accessory dwelling units.
Right. Okay. Thanks for enlightening us on that.
Follow up on that if possible.
Okay.
Noah brought up the ancillary fact that's highly related. I think it's important, as the gentleman from Amherst pointed out also, that the auxiliary dwelling unit trend we're finding to be a growing trend. And with auxiliary dwelling units, at least in Milford, defined as 750 square feet down, with ostensibly no lower limit, that we are finding at least a growth in that market.
Right.
And
excuse me, are you, when you say auxiliary dwelling units, is that what we'd be also calling accessory dwelling units?
Yes.
Okay.
It's ADU. Our town has chosen to call it auxiliary dwelling units. It just must be secondary to the main house, and
right.
It says an adjoining wall, but we do have provisions for a detached auxiliary dwelling unit as well.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, and actually that ties well. There's a question in the chat wondering how we count accessory dwelling units. And at this point, so far up through this most recent survey, we have asked the towns to count the accessory dwelling units as multifamily housing. So if it's something built with an existing house, it's a conversion. That's required a little bit of explanation to the towns. But we sort of review the structure of the form each year, and we've talked about putting ADUs in as a separate entry. And I'm sure we might be revisiting that as well. But right now, in this report and in previous reports, they are considered multifamily.
Okay, we're saying I'm not seeing any other hands raised or questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So Stephanie just asked, what about 2-family units?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
How are 2-family units counted, duplexes counted in the survey?
Those are counted as multifamily housing. That's actually the second line in the survey. So yeah, if they're two separate housing units in the same building, those are considered multifamily. Okay, well, that's what we have today. And if you have any other questions, like I said, please feel free to contact me directly. And as with that, I thank you again for attending. This is the second one of our series, and we plan to be doing similar presentations with other topics from our office. We're going to try to do it on a monthly basis, so we'll keep you posted with what the next one will be. And thanks again for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.